There's a farm in the Austrian Alps, perched at an altitude of 1,500 meters above sea level, where government agricultural experts officially declared in writing that commercial food production was absolutely and permanently impossible, that has been producing abundant harvests of over 70 different crop species for more than 50 consecutive years, without any irrigation whatsoever, without any synthetic fertilizers, without any pesticides or herbicides, and without following a single regulation that Austrian farming authorities repeatedly demanded the owner obey or face legal consequences. The farm is called Krameterhof, and the man who transformed it from failing conventional agriculture into one of the most remarkably productive small farms in all of Europe has spent most of his entire adult life being fined, sued, prosecuted, and threatened by the same government officials whose own agricultural policies have driven thousands of Austrian farms into bankruptcy and abandonment over the same period. His name is Sepp Holzer, and his crime was proving through decades of documented results that absolutely everything the credentialed experts believed about farming was demonstrably and completely wrong. When Holzer inherited his family's struggling mountain farm in 1962 at the young age of just 19 years old, agricultural advisors from the Austrian government told him bluntly that the property was essentially worthless for any serious commercial food production. The altitude was simply too high for reliable crop production. The growing season was far too short for most valuable crops. The soil was too thin, too rocky, and too acidic to support commercial agriculture. The winters were too harsh and too long for any but the hardiest subsistence crops. The slopes were too steep for practical cultivation using approved methods. Every scientific principle of modern agricultural science that these experts had studied in university said the young farmer should either abandon the land entirely or accept minimal subsistence-level production for the rest of his natural life. Holzer rejected every single piece of expert advice he received from these credentialed authorities and spent the next 5 remarkable decades proving conclusively that nature operates by principles the experts had simply never bothered to observe in actual practice. He transformed 45 hectares of supposedly dead alpine terrain into a thriving ecosystem that produces fruit, vegetables, grains, herbs, fish, and livestock in quantities that neighboring conventional farms at lower altitudes cannot match. He eliminated all need for irrigation by creating a network of interconnected ponds that capture rainfall, moderate temperature extremes, and create microclimates where tropical plants survive Austrian winters. He built soil from bare rock using techniques that agricultural science said would take centuries if they worked at all. And for his success, the Austrian government fined him repeatedly, threatened to demolish his ponds, ordered him to remove his trees, and dragged him through court proceedings that lasted years. This is the powerful and infuriating story of the rebel farmer, who proved conclusively that dead soil can live again, that water can be completely free, and that governments protect failing systems more fiercely than they support successful innovation. If this knowledge matters to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Let's begin. The techniques Sepp Holzer developed on his alpine farm represent a fundamental rejection of every principle that modern industrial agriculture considers settled science. Conventional agriculture treats soil as a medium for holding plants, while synthetic fertilizers provide nutrition, but Holzer understood that soil is a living ecosystem that feeds plants naturally when properly supported. He observed that forest floors produce abundant plant growth without any human fertilization, because fallen organic matter decomposes continuously, releasing nutrients in forms that plants can access immediately. He observed that natural systems concentrate fertility rather than depleting it, building richer soil year after year without external inputs. He observed that the agricultural experts advising him had studied chemistry and mechanics, but had never spent time watching how nature actually operates without human interference. His foundational technique, which he developed independently before learning that others had discovered similar principles, involves burying large quantities of woody material beneath growing beds. Holzer buries entire tree trunks, branches, and woody debris in long raised mounds that he plants with vegetables, fruits, and grains. As the wood slowly decomposes over years and decades, it releases nutrients continuously while acting as a massive sponge that absorbs rainfall and releases moisture gradually during dry periods. The decomposition process generates heat that extends growing seasons in both spring and fall. The woody structure creates air pockets that plant roots exploit for rapid expansion. This technique, now known globally as hugelkultur, allows Holzer to grow crops without irrigation in an alpine climate where rainfall is irregular and summer drought is common. A single hugelkultur bed can retain thousands of liters of water within its woody core, releasing moisture to plant roots over weeks or months without any external watering. The beds actually become more productive as they age because decomposition accelerates once fungal networks establish throughout the buried wood. Beds that Holzer built 30 and 40 years ago still produce abundant harvests while requiring no water inputs beyond natural rainfall. The water retention capacity of his hugelkultur system made expensive irrigation infrastructure completely unnecessary, eliminating costs that drain profits from conventional farms. The pond system Holzer constructed across his property transforms the entire farm into a self-regulating water cycle that conventional engineering said could not function at alpine altitudes. Holzer has built over 70 ponds across his 45-hectare property, ranging from small pools to substantial lakes covering hundreds of square meters. The ponds are not decorative features, but functional infrastructure that captures precipitation, moderates temperature extremes, creates wildlife habitat, produces fish for harvest, and generates microclimates that allow heat-loving plants to survive conditions that would otherwise kill them. Each pond is positioned to overflow into the next during heavy rainfall, creating a cascading system that moves water across the entire property without pumps or powered infrastructure. The thermal mass of water stored in the ponds moderates temperature swings that would otherwise limit crop production at alpine altitudes. Water absorbs heat during warm days and releases it during cold nights, reducing frost damage in spring and fall. The ponds create humid microclimates immediately around their edges, where plants that could never survive exposed alpine conditions thrive in the moderated environment. Holzer grows figs, kiwis, and other subtropical species at 1,500 meters altitude by positioning them near ponds that buffer temperature extremes. The reflection of sunlight from pond surfaces onto adjacent slopes increases the solar energy reaching nearby plants. South-facing slopes behind north-facing ponds receive direct sunlight plus reflected light from the water surface, effectively increasing the growing energy available to crops positioned in these locations. Holzer carefully calculates pond placement to maximize this reflection effect, creating growing conditions at high altitude that mimic lower elevation farms. The pond system also produces substantial harvests of fish that require no feeding beyond the natural productivity of the aquatic ecosystems. Holzer stocks his ponds with carp, trout, and other species that feed on aquatic plants, insects, and organic debris without requiring purchased fish food. The fish represent a protein harvest that emerges from water that would otherwise simply drain away as runoff. The economic value of the fish production alone would justify the pond construction, but the water storage, climate moderation, and irrigation elimination provide benefits far exceeding the direct harvest value. Austrian authorities declared that Holzer's pond construction was illegal because he had not obtained proper engineering permits. The conflict between Sepp Holzer and Austrian agricultural authorities reveals a system designed to protect institutional expertise rather than encourage successful innovation. When Holzer began constructing ponds without engineering permits, authorities issued fines and demanded he drain the ponds and restore the original terrain. The regulations required professional engineering assessments, environmental impact studies, and construction permits that would have cost more than Holzer earned from his entire farm operation. The regulations assumed that any water impoundment required expert design to prevent dam failure, flooding, and environmental damage. The regulations made no provision for the small, shallow, overflow-designed ponds that Holzer was constructing, which presented none of the risks that the permit requirements were designed to address. Holzer fought the fines in court, arguing that his ponds improved rather than damaged the environment. He demonstrated that his property supported more wildlife, more plant diversity, and more ecological productivity than any comparable area managed according to approved practices. He showed that his ponds did not threaten downstream properties because they were designed to overflow harmlessly rather than retain water behind dams that could fail catastrophically. He presented evidence that his methods were succeeding, while conventional farms following approved practices were failing throughout the region. The courts eventually reduced his fines but did not change the regulations that made his techniques technically illegal. Holzer remained in legal jeopardy throughout his farming career, subject to new fines whenever officials chose to enforce regulations he could not comply with and still farm successfully. The legal uncertainty made it difficult to teach his methods to other Austrian farmers who feared similar prosecution. The regulatory environment actively discouraged the adoption of techniques that demonstrably worked better than approved alternatives. Authorities also fined Holzer for growing plant species that were not approved for cultivation at his altitude and climate zone. Austrian agricultural regulations specified which crops could be grown in which regions based on official climate classifications. Holzer's subtropical plants, grown successfully in pond-moderated microclimates, violated these classifications because the regulations did not account for the possibility that a farmer might modify local conditions enough to grow crops outside their designated zones. The fines punished his success at doing what experts said was impossible. The principles underlying Holzer's success apply far beyond his specific alpine conditions and have been replicated on degraded land across multiple continents. The core principle is working with natural processes rather than against them, observing how ecosystems function and designing farms that exploit rather than fight those functions. Conventional agriculture fights nature constantly, killing weeds, killing insects, killing soil organisms, killing everything except the single crop species the farmer wants to harvest. The fighting requires continuous inputs of energy, chemicals, labor, and money that drain profitability while degrading the land's long-term productivity. Each season of conventional farming leaves the soil worse than before, requiring increased inputs to maintain declining yields. Holzer's approach builds rather than depletes, creating conditions where natural processes do work that conventional farming pays for. Weeds are either tolerated as beneficial ground cover or replaced with productive plants that serve the same soil protecting function while yielding harvests. Insects are balanced by predator populations that establish naturally in diverse ecosystems rather than eliminated with chemicals that kill beneficial species along with pests. Soil organisms are fed and supported rather than poisoned, creating nutrient cycling that replaces synthetic fertilizer inputs. The reduction in input costs transforms the economics of small-scale farming from marginal survival to genuine prosperity. Holzer's farm requires no purchased fertilizer, no irrigation infrastructure, no pesticides, no herbicides, and minimal equipment compared to conventional operations. The money that conventional farmers spend on inputs stays in Holzer's pocket as profit. The time that conventional farmers spend applying inputs is available for Holzer to spend expanding production or teaching others. Degraded lands that conventional agriculture has abandoned as worthless can be restored using Holzer's principles. He has consulted on projects in Spain, Portugal, Scotland, Colombia, and numerous other countries where farmers have applied his techniques to land considered beyond recovery. Desertified soils have been rebuilt. Eroded slopes have been stabilized. Depleted aquifers have been recharged. Each project demonstrates that the techniques are not specific to Austrian Alpine conditions, but represent universal principles applicable wherever humans have damaged land through conventional practices. The agricultural system that fined Sepp Holzer continues promoting practices that are driving farms into bankruptcy while dismissing the methods that made him successful. Austrian agriculture loses farms every year to economic pressures that Holzer's methods directly address. Small farms cannot compete with industrial operations when both are paying for the same inputs at the same prices. The input costs that conventional agriculture considers unavoidable consume profit margins that determine whether farms survive or fail. Farms that cannot reduce input costs must either grow larger to achieve economies of scale or go bankrupt. The consolidation eliminates farming families and rural communities while increasing dependence on practices that degrade long-term land productivity. Holzer's techniques allow small farms to achieve profitability that industrial scale cannot match because they eliminate costs rather than spreading them across more production. A small farm with zero fertilizer costs, zero irrigation costs, zero pesticide costs, and minimal equipment costs can be profitable at production levels that would bankrupt a conventional operation paying for all those inputs. The economic advantage of eliminating inputs increases as input prices rise, making Holzer's methods more attractive precisely when conventional farming becomes most difficult. Agricultural education continues teaching the input-dependent methods that are failing rather than the observation-based methods that succeed. University programs train students in chemistry, mechanics, and business management, while providing minimal instruction in ecological observation or natural system function. The graduates enter farming careers equipped to manage input-dependent operations, but unable to imagine alternatives that might eliminate input dependence entirely. The educational system reproduces the assumptions that keep farmers trapped in failing practices. The same regulatory systems that fined Holzer for success continue protecting practices that guarantee failure. Regulations specify approved seeds, approved chemicals, approved practices, and approved outcomes that collectively define conventional agriculture as the only legal option. Farmers who deviate from approved practices risk fines, loss of subsidies, and exclusion from markets that require regulatory compliance. The system makes following Holzer's example legally risky, even when farmers can see that his results exceed anything conventional methods achieve. The farm that Austrian authorities said could not produce food has been feeding people and teaching farmers for over 50 years, while the experts who dismissed Holzer have been proven wrong repeatedly. Every prediction the agricultural advisors made in 1962 has been definitively disproven by decades of abundant harvests. They said the altitude was too high, but Holzer grows crops at 1,500 meters that farms at 500 meters struggle to produce. They said the growing season was too short, but Holzer's season extension techniques provide harvests from early spring through late autumn. They said the soil was too poor, but Holzer built soil that now exceeds the fertility of the best lowland farms. They said the slopes were too steep, but Holzer's terracing creates more growing surface than flat fields would provide. The ponds they ordered him to drain still capture rainfall, still moderate temperatures, still produce fish, and still eliminate the irrigation costs that burden every conventional farm in the region. The Hugelkultur beds they could not comprehend still hold moisture through summer droughts, still release nutrients without fertilizer applications, still produce harvests that exceed anything achieved with approved methods. The techniques they fined him for developing are now taught in permaculture courses worldwide, while Austrian agricultural extension services continue recommending the input-dependent practices that are bankrupting Austrian farms. Sepp Holzer is now in his 80s and has spent recent decades traveling internationally as a consultant, teaching the very methods that Austrian authorities tried so hard and so persistently to suppress through fines and legal action. Students and farmers from around the world travel to visit Krameterhof specifically to learn techniques that actually work in practice. Farmers on 5 different continents have successfully applied his core principles to restore degraded land that conventional agriculture abandoned as worthless. The methods that one small European government tried desperately to eliminate through fines, regulations, and court proceedings have now spread globally precisely because they succeed dramatically where conventional agriculture fails miserably. Dead soil brought to life through observation and patience. $5,000 in annual water costs eliminated completely and permanently. 70 different crop species growing and thriving where credentialed experts insisted absolutely nothing could survive. 50 consecutive years of documented proof that careful observation beats formal expertise every single time. They fined him because successful alternatives that cost nothing threaten industries built on failure, regulatory systems built on approved practices, and experts whose careers are built on credentials rather than demonstrated results. Now you know what one stubborn Austrian farmer proved through 5 decades of work while his own government tried repeatedly to stop him. Now you understand why they find farmers who succeed outside the system, rather than study what those farmers discovered and apply those lessons to help others. If this opened something important for you today, subscribe and hit the bell. Every single like and share spreads what agricultural authorities have spent decades trying to suppress and bury. See you in the next one.